By December 1944, Edward R. Kirkland was already a statistic. Shot down, captured, processed through German military channels like cargo. His dog tags hung in enemy hands. His flight suit marked him as American property now held behind wire. The guards knew their procedures. Thousands of Allied airmen had come before him. None had walked out. Kirkland had no weapon, no map, no radio, just the cold pressing through thin fabric and the certainty that his war was over. But what the Germans could not catalogue was the calculation already forming behind his eyes. The mathematics of captivity in late 1944 Europe offered no rational path to freedom. American airmen shot down over German-held territory faced a system designed precisely for them. The Luftwaffe had processed tens of thousands of Allied flyers since the war began. They knew how to strip a man of hope before he ever reached the wire. First came the shock of transition. One moment a pilot commanded a machine that could outrun most things on Earth. The next, he stood in a field surrounded by armed men who had every reason to hate him. The psychological whiplash alone broke many prisoners before interrogation even began. For Kirkland, the ground came up fast. The Thunderbolt that had carried him through countless missions was gone, reduced to twisted metal somewhere in the German countryside. Whatever damage had brought him down left him with nothing but his body and his training. The guards who collected him knew exactly what they held. A P-47 pilot represented months of American investment. Flight school, advanced training, combat experience accumulated over dozens of sorties. Each downed airman was a small victory extracted from the 8th Air Force's relentless campaign against the Reich. They searched him thoroughly. Survival kits vanished. Escape aids concealed in boots and buttons were discovered and confiscated. The Germans had learned every trick the Allied intelligence services had devised. They knew about the compasses hidden in uniform buttons. They knew about the silk maps sewn into flight jackets. They knew about the currency and language cards tucked into every possible crevice. What remained after the search was a man in borrowed clothes with nothing but his memory and his will. The transit system moved captured airmen through a series of holding facilities before depositing them in permanent camps. Each transfer offered theoretical opportunities for escape, but the reality was different. Guards outnumbered prisoners at every checkpoint. The German population had been warned about enemy airmen. Civilians were often more dangerous than soldiers, their anger at the bombing campaign running deeper than any professional military restraint. For an American hundreds of miles from friendly lines, escape meant walking through territory where everyone was an enemy. No food sources, no safe houses, no underground railroad waiting to guide him home. Just occupied Europe in winter with German military police, Hitler Youth, and ordinary citizens all watching for men exactly like him. The rational calculation was simple. Stay captured, wait for the war to end. Hope the camp administration followed the Geneva Convention. Hope the Red Cross packages arrived. Hope liberation came before disease or desperation. Thousands of American airmen had made that calculation and accepted it. They waited in their bunks and counted the days, trusting that survival meant patience. Kirkland understood the mathematics as well as anyone. He had seen what happened to men who tried to run. He knew the stories of airmen shot during escape attempts, beaten by civilians, or simply disappeared into the German system never to be seen again. But something in his calculation produced a different answer. The camps held men who had stopped thinking about anything except the next meal and the next morning. They had surrendered not just their bodies, but their initiative. They had become exactly what the Germans expected them to become. Kirkland looked at the wire and the guards and the vast hostile territory beyond, and he saw something else entirely. He saw gaps in attention, routines that could be predicted, moments when certainty became assumption. The Germans expected compliance because compliance was rational. What they could not anticipate was a man who had decided that rationality was no longer his operating principle. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Edward R. Kirkland came to the Army Air Forces from the America that existed before everything changed. The details of his early life follow the pattern of countless young men who found themselves in cockpits over Europe, a childhood shaped by the Depression, an education interrupted or accelerated by war, a moment when recruitment posters and newsreels and the simple logic of duty converged into a decision that would define everything that followed. What mattered for what came later was not where Kirkland grew up or what his father did for a living. What mattered was the particular way his mind had been trained to work once he entered the military aviation pipeline. The Army Air Force's selection process in the early 1940s screened for specific cognitive traits. They wanted men who could process multiple information streams simultaneously, men who could make decisions under time pressure without freezing, men who could hold a plan in their heads while adapting to conditions that changed by the second. Kirkland passed these screens and entered the training system that would produce over 200,000 pilots by the war's end. Primary training taught him the basics of flight. Basic training refined his instrument skills and aerobatic capability. Advanced training introduced him to tactical combat operations, but the real education came in the transition to the aircraft that would carry him into combat. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was unlike anything the Army Air Forces had ever fielded. At over 7 tons fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, driving a massive 4-blade propeller that pulled the aircraft through the air with brutal efficiency. Learning to fly the Thunderbolt meant learning to think differently about aerial combat. The aircraft could not turn with lighter German fighters. It could not climb with them either. What it could do was dive, faster than anything in the sky, and absorb punishment that would destroy lesser machines. Pilots who survived in Thunderbolts learned to fight on their own terms. They used altitude as a weapon, trading height for speed in attacks that left enemy fighters no time to react. They trusted the aircraft's 850 caliber machine guns to deliver overwhelming firepower in brief, decisive passes. Most importantly, they learned to maintain situational awareness in conditions that overwhelmed ordinary perception. A combat mission might involve hundreds of aircraft maneuvering simultaneously across miles of sky. Threats could emerge from any direction. The pilot who lost track of his environment died, usually without ever seeing what killed him. This training produced a specific kind of mind. Kirkland learned to scan constantly, process rapidly, and act decisively even when the situation seemed hopeless. He learned that survival depended on continuing to think when every instinct screamed for panic or surrender. The operational tempo of 1944 refined these skills under conditions no training could simulate. By the time Kirkland flew his fateful mission, he had accumulated the experience that separated veterans from replacements. He had seen friends die. He had felt his aircraft shudder under enemy fire. He had made it home on engines that should not have kept running. Each mission taught lessons that accumulated into something like wisdom. He learned that German anti-aircraft gunners were most accurate at specific altitudes and in specific weather conditions. He learned that Luftwaffe fighters preferred certain tactical approaches. He learned that survival often depended on decisions made in fractions of seconds based on information that barely registered consciously. What the training and experience could not prepare him for was the moment when all of it would have to be applied without an aircraft around him. The skills that kept him alive in the sky would prove Equally valuable on the ground, in circumstances his instructors had never imagined. The unit that carried Kirkland into combat flew as part of the massive American air campaign against the German war machine. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force and its fighter escorts had achieved air superiority over most of Europe. German industry lay in ruins. German transportation networks had been shattered. The Luftwaffe still flew, but in diminishing numbers against overwhelming Allied strength. This superiority came at a cost measured in thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of airmen. The statistical reality was stark. Fly enough missions and probability would eventually catch you. Mechanical failure, weather, enemy fighters, flak. The sky offered infinite ways to die, and every pilot knew that luck was a finite resource. Kirkland flew, knowing that his turn might come on any sortie. He prepared for it in the ways pilots prepared, checking his survival gear before each mission, memorizing escape procedures that might never be used, maintaining the mental discipline that separated those who functioned under stress from those who froze. When his turn finally came, he was as ready as any man could be for a moment that no one is ever truly ready to face. The mission that ended Kirkland's flying war began like dozens before it. Briefings before dawn, weather reports and target coordinates, intelligence assessments of expected opposition, the familiar ritual of preparation that preceded every sortie into hostile airspace. The Thunderbolt he climbed into that morning was a machine he knew intimately. Every switch and gauge had been checked countless times. The massive engine turned over with its characteristic rumble, settling into the rhythm that would carry him across the Channel and into Germany. Formation assembly over England brought the group together in patterns rehearsed until they became automatic. Fighters arranged themselves for the long flight ahead, conserving fuel while maintaining the mutual support that kept individual aircraft from becoming isolated targets. The Channel crossing marked the transition from relative safety to constant danger. Below, the gray water gave way to occupied territory where every man with a rifle or a radio represented a potential threat. Above, the contrails of other formations traced white lines against the sky, marking the scale of the American effort. What brought Kirkland down on this particular day remains unclear in the specific details. The chaos of aerial combat produces fragmented memories and incomplete records. What survives is the essential fact. His Thunderbolt sustained damage that could not be overcome. It might have been flak. German anti-aircraft defenses in late 1944 remained formidable despite Allied air superiority. The 88-meter guns could reach altitudes that pilots once considered safe, and the barrage fire over defended targets created corridors of probability where even luck eventually failed. It might have been fighters. The Luftwaffe still possessed capable pilots in capable aircraft, men who had learned to pick their moments and exploit any lapse in formation discipline. A split second of inattention could put a burst of cannon fire through an engine or a fuel tank. It might have been mechanical failure. The Thunderbolt was a robust aircraft, but every machine has limits. Thousands of moving parts operating under extreme stress would eventually find their breaking points. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Kirkland found himself in an aircraft that would no longer fly. The decision tree narrowed to its final branches. Ride the dying machine down and attempt a forced landing, bail out and trust the parachute. Stay with the aircraft too long and die in the wreckage. He chose the parachute. The exit from a stricken P-47 followed procedures drilled into every pilot. Canopy jettisoned, harness released, body tumbling free into the slipstream. The violence of the transition from enclosed cockpit to open sky was disorienting even in training. In combat, with adrenaline flooding the system and the aircraft spinning or burning or both, It became something closer to controlled chaos. The parachute opened. The silence after engine. Noise was profound. Below, the German countryside spread out in patterns of field and forest and village that looked peaceful from altitude. None of it was friendly. The descent took perhaps 3 minutes, time enough to survey the landing zone and calculate the reception waiting below, time enough to consider the equipment in the survival kit and the procedures for evasion, time enough to understand that the mathematics of the situation offered no good solutions. Kirkland came down in territory where escape was effectively impossible. The exact location matters less than the essential fact. He was deep in German-controlled Europe, visible during his descent to anyone watching, and entirely alone. The reception committee arrived quickly, German soldiers or civilians or both, drawn by the spectacle of a parachute and the knowledge of what it meant. They found an American pilot gathering his equipment and preparing to resist, but resistance against armed captors offered nothing but a faster death. The capture followed standard patterns. Rough handling at first, the anger of men who had lived under bombing campaigns for years expressed in physical terms. Then organization as military discipline reasserted itself. The prisoner had value. He would be processed according to procedures. Kirkland found himself in the system that had swallowed tens of thousands of Allied airmen before him. He surrendered his survival gear, his identification, his freedom. What he did not surrender was the capacity for calculation that his training had instilled. Even as guards surrounded him and the reality of captivity settled in, his mind continued to work the problem. He observed routines. He noted gaps. He began to understand that compliance was expected precisely because it was rational, and that expectations could be exploited by those willing to act outside the boundaries of reason. The journey from capture point to holding facility exposed him to the rhythms of the German prisoner handling system. Each transfer, each checkpoint, each change of guard revealed information that most prisoners simply endured without analysis. Kirkland studied it all. He was learning the terrain of a different kind of combat. The German system for handling captured Allied airmen had evolved through years of experience into something approaching industrial efficiency. Dulag Luft, the transit camp near Frankfurt, processed thousands of aircrews through interrogation and classification. Intelligence officers there had refined their techniques until they could extract useful information from prisoners who believed they were revealing nothing. The questions seemed casual, almost friendly. The implications of the answers were anything but. Kirkland passed through this system like all the others, providing only the required information under the Geneva Convention: name, rank, service number, date of birth. The interrogators asked for more and received nothing, but their expectations for cooperation in escape prevention were different from their expectations for intelligence. The guards who managed prisoner transfers operated on assumptions built from thousands of repetitions. American airmen, they had learned, were predictable. They complained about food. They talked too loudly. They formed obvious cliques based on unit and regional origin. They dreamed about escape, but rarely acted on those dreams. The ones who did attempt escape followed predictable patterns as well. They hoarded food. They made plans with other prisoners. They watched the wire with obvious interest. They gave away their intentions through behavior that trained guards could read like text. What the guards expected, above all, was compliance with the fundamental logic of captivity. A prisoner far from friendly lines, surrounded by enemies, lacking resources and local knowledge, would recognize the futility of resistance. He would wait. He would hope. He would accept that his fate now rested in hands beyond his control. This expectation was so deeply embedded in the German prisoner management system that it had become invisible. Guards no longer consciously thought about why prisoners complied. They simply assumed compliance as a natural law, like gravity or the movement of the sun. The facilities that held Kirkland in transit reflected this assumption in their design. Security measured against organized escape attempts, procedures designed to prevent tunneling, cutting, or coordinated breakouts. Resources allocated according to threat assessments that focused on groups rather than individuals. What the system was not designed to handle was a single man who decided that the rules governing rational behavior no longer applied to him. The guards who watched Kirkland during his captivity saw what they expected to see: an American pilot, physically intact, psychologically stable, going through the adjustments that all new prisoners experienced. He ate what was provided. He answered to his name. He followed instructions without significant resistance. What they did not see was the continuous calculation behind the compliant exterior. Kirkland was mapping his environment in detail, no standard. Observation would reveal. He was timing guard rotations. He was identifying the moments when attention lapsed and routines became mechanical. He was storing information that most prisoners never thought to gather. The transit system moved captured airmen through stages designed to strip away resistance and prepare them for permanent internment. Each stage offered diminishing opportunities for escape as security tightened and familiarity with individual prisoners increased. The window for action, if it existed at all, was narrow and closing. Most prisoners sensed this window without ever considering seriously whether to exploit it. The risks were too high, the probability of success too low, the consequences of failure too severe. Kirkland looked at the same mathematics and reached a different conclusion. He understood the risks. He understood the probabilities. But he had also identified something the Germans had not anticipated. Their system was built on certainty. Every guard, every checkpoint, every procedure assumed that certain behaviors were impossible because they were irrational. This certainty created gaps that rationality could never have exploited. The Germans knew how to watch for tunnel diggers. They knew how to identify groups planning coordinated breakouts. They knew how to break prisoners who showed obvious signs of resistance. What they did not know was how to defend against a man who had decided to act alone, without warning, in a moment when no one was watching because no one believed watching was necessary. Kirkland waited. He observed. He refined his understanding of the rhythms that governed captive life, and he identified the moment when certainty would become vulnerability. The first escape happened in a gap that existed because no one believed it could be used. The exact circumstances resist precise reconstruction. Records from the German prisoner handling system in late 1944 are fragmentary, scattered across archives or lost entirely in the chaos of the war's final months. What survives is the essential fact. Kirkland identified an opportunity that his guards did not believe was possible, and he acted on it before conscious thought could intervene. It might have been a moment during transit. The movement of prisoners from one facility to another created brief periods when security relied on assumption rather than observation. A man who moved with confidence in the right direction at the right moment could create distance before anyone understood what had happened. It might have been an unguarded door. The infrastructure of captivity in late 1944, strained under the weight of prisoners and the demands of a collapsing war effort. Facilities designed for hundreds held thousands. Guard details that should have numbered dozens made do with fewer. Somewhere in this overstressed system, a barrier that should have been watched was not. It might have been simple audacity. The German guards expected certain behaviors and watched for them. They did not expect a prisoner to walk away in plain sight in a moment of routine as if captivity had never happened. Whatever the specific mechanism, the result was the same. Kirkland moved from inside the system to outside it, from captured to free, from prisoner to evader. The transition took seconds. The silence that followed was the most dangerous moment. Guards who had not yet registered the escape continued their routines. Prisoners who might have witnessed the departure remained still, their own calculations favoring silence over alarm. The machinery of captivity kept turning on its assumptions, while reality had already departed from expectation. Kirkland used this silence like a weapon. Every second of incomprehension was distance gained. Every moment of normalcy was cover for movement that would soon be hunted. The alarm, when it came, set into motion the response protocols that German authorities had developed for exactly these situations. Search parties, alerts to civilian authorities, coordination with military police, the systematic closing of escape routes that had served other evaders in years past, but the protocols assumed a fleeing man would behave predictably. He would seek shelter. He would move at night. He would try to reach neutral territory or link up with resistance networks. The system was designed to intercept these predictable movements. What Kirkland did in the hours and days following his first escape remains partially obscured by the fragmentary record. What is certain is that the freedom he gained proved temporary. The territory he moved through was hostile in ways that geography alone could not overcome. Every face was potentially an enemy, every shelter potentially a trap. The recapture came, as most recaptures did, through the accumulation of small disadvantages. A man without food cannot move indefinitely. A man without shelter in winter cannot maintain the physical capacity for continued evasion. A man without local knowledge cannot navigate around the checkpoints and patrols that waited for exactly someone like him. German authorities recovered their prisoner. The system that had briefly lost him absorbed him once again. The protocols for handling escape attempts engaged, adding surveillance and restriction to his captivity. But something had changed in the calculation. The guards, who now watched Kirkland more carefully, had been embarrassed by his escape. They had been shown that their assumptions about prisoner behavior could be wrong. They adjusted their procedures and increased their attention. What they did not do was question the fundamental assumption that had failed them. They believed Kirkland's escape was an anomaly, a fortunate exploitation of a specific gap that had now been closed. They did not consider the possibility that the gap had not been the cause, but merely the opportunity. The cause was still present. It was the mind that continued to calculate, even when calculation seemed pointless. It was the refusal to accept that probability dictated passivity. It was the understanding that systems built on certainty contained their own vulnerabilities. Kirkland endured the increased surveillance. He accepted the restrictions. He appeared to have learned the lesson that escape was impossible. He was learning something else entirely. The first escape had taught him what worked and what did not. It had shown him the limits of individual action against organized response. It had revealed the specific ways that German authorities reacted to prisoner escapes and the assumptions that governed their search procedures. Most prisoners who survived recapture internalized the lesson of failure. They stopped thinking about escape. They accepted that the one attempt allowed by fortune had been used up. Kirkland internalized a different lesson. He had come closer to sustained freedom than most prisoners ever would. The factors that had led to recapture were identifiable and potentially correctable. The assumptions that had allowed escape in the first place still governed the system, despite the increased attention focused on him specifically. He began calculating again. The second escape required a different approach. Kirkland was now a marked man. His file carried notations that flagged him as an escape risk. Guards who processed him knew to watch more carefully. The comfortable invisibility of the ordinary prisoner was gone, but being watched created its own opportunities. Guards who believed they understood the threat looked for the behaviors they had been trained to recognize. They watched for hoarding. They watched for coordination with other prisoners. They watched for the obvious signs that had preceded other escape attempts. What they could not watch for was the absence of these signs. They could not monitor a man who gave every appearance of resignation while his mind continued to work the problem. They could not anticipate an approach so simple that it existed outside their trained expectations. The timing of the second escape aligned with the increasing chaos of the war's final months. By late 1944 and into 1945, the German military situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Soviet offensive in the east and the Allied advances in the west compressed the remaining Reich territory. Resources that had once been allocated to prisoner management were diverted to more pressing needs. This compression created stress fractures in systems that had operated smoothly when the Reich controlled most of Europe. Guard details were reduced as men were sent to combat units. Facilities originally designed for permanent occupation became way stations in the constant movement of prisoners away from advancing fronts. The careful procedures that had processed Kirkland's initial capture began to break down under pressures they were never designed to handle. Kirkland observed this breakdown as he had observed everything else. He noted the increasing fatigue in his guards. He tracked the disruptions to routines that had once been clockwork regular. He identified the moments when systematic control degraded into improvisation. The opportunity came in a transfer. The movement of prisoners across the contracting Reich created logistical challenges that overwhelmed the remaining German capacity. Men were moved in groups larger than guard details could properly monitor. Checkpoints that should have verified every prisoner sometimes waved columns through to clear backlogs. The assumption of compliance, always present, became even more dominant as the resources to enforce it became scarcer. The specifics of Kirkland's second escape resist definitive reconstruction for the same reasons as the first. What survives in the record is the fact itself. He escaped German captivity a second time. This time, the circumstances of the war itself worked in his favor. The advancing Allied forces were closer than they had been during his first escape. The German capacity to organize systematic searches was degraded. The civilian population, sensing the coming end, was less uniformly hostile to escaped prisoners who might soon represent the winning side. The journey from second escape to Allied lines required Kirkland to survive in hostile territory for a period that tested everything his training had instilled. He moved through a landscape of collapsed certainties where German authority still nominally controlled but no longer effectively governed. He avoided patrols that were searching for larger prey. He found sustenance in a land where resources were increasingly scarce for everyone. The exact route and duration of his evasion remain incompletely documented. What is certain is the outcome. Edward R. Kirkland reached Allied forces. He was processed through the systems that received recovered airmen, debriefed on his experiences, and documented in the records that would preserve his story. 2 escapes, 2 recaptures, or, in the second case, successful evasion to friendly lines. A statistical anomaly that emerged from the combination of individual determination and systemic assumption. The immediate impact of Kirkland's actions extended beyond his personal survival. Intelligence officers who debriefed returned escapees extracted information about German prisoner handling procedures, guard deployments, and territorial conditions. Each successful evader contributed to the understanding that would help future escapees and inform tactical decisions. More broadly, Kirkland's example represented a data point in the ongoing contest between systemic control and individual agency. The German prisoner system had been designed by professionals who understood human behavior and organized their procedures accordingly. They had created something that worked, most of the time, against most prisoners. What they could not design against was the outlier, the man who refused to accept the logic that governed everyone around him, the mind that continued calculating when calculation seemed pointless, the will that found gaps in certainty and exploited them before conscious thought could intervene. The war ended with Kirkland on the Allied side of the lines. The systems that had held him ceased to exist. The guards who had watched him dispersed into the chaos of German defeat. The assumptions that had failed to contain him became historical artifacts, studied later by those who sought to understand how such things worked. For Kirkland, the immediate aftermath brought the bureaucratic processing that attended every returning airman: medical evaluation, administrative paperwork, the slow transition from combat status to whatever came next. The machinery of the American military absorbed him back as thoroughly as the German machinery had once tried to hold him. After the war, Edward R. Kirkland returned to the America he had left years before. The exact contours of his post-war life follow the patterns common to millions of returning veterans: demobilization, readjustment, the construction of a civilian existence from the rubble of wartime experience. The details belong to him and to those who knew him, not to the historical record that preserves only the facts deemed significant. What is known is that he did not seek the attention that his escapes might have warranted. He did not write memoirs or give lectures or trade on his experiences for public recognition. He became, in the way of most veterans, someone who had done extraordinary things and then returned to ordinary life as if the extraordinary had been merely an interruption. This quiet return was itself a kind of answer to the question his escapes had posed. He had acted when action seemed impossible, not because he sought glory, but because his mind simply continued to function when others shut down. The same quality that had identified gaps in German certainty now found its expression in the steady construction of a peacetime life. The recognition he received came through official channels, the awards and citations that documented what he had done without requiring him to speak of it. These records preserved his story for those who would later seek to understand what certain men did under certain circumstances. They transformed individual action into historical data available for study and interpretation. Historians who later examined escaped prisoner accounts found in cases like Kirkland's a particular type of response to captivity, not the organized escape committees that planned elaborate breakouts, not the tunnel projects that occupied hundreds of men for months. Something simpler and, in its own way, more remarkable: the individual who refused to accept that individual action was pointless. The German system had been designed to make individual escape impossible. It had largely succeeded. The prisoners who escaped in significant numbers did so through organized efforts that pooled resources and distributed risk. The lone escapee was statistically insignificant, a rounding error in the thousands processed through the system. But statistical insignificance is not the same as impossibility. Kirkland's 2 escapes demonstrated that the gap between improbable and impossible was wide enough for a determined man to pass through. They showed that systems built on assumptions about human behavior could be defeated by humans who refused to behave as assumed. This lesson extended beyond the specific circumstances of prisoner escape. It spoke to something fundamental about the relationship between individual agency and systemic control. Every system, no matter how well designed, contains assumptions. Every assumption represents a vulnerability to those willing to act outside expected parameters. The quiet decades that followed the war gave Kirkland time to reflect on what he had done and why. If he reached conclusions about the meaning of his experiences, he kept them largely to himself. The man who had twice broken free from German captivity did not feel compelled to explain himself to those who had not been there. What remained was the fact itself, preserved in records that would outlast everyone who had been involved. A pilot shot down over Germany, a prisoner who escaped, a recapture, a second escape, a return to Allied lines. The dry facts concealed the human reality that lay beneath them, the fear that must have accompanied every moment of evasion, the physical suffering of movement through hostile territory without adequate food or shelter, the psychological weight of knowing that recapture meant not just imprisonment, but likely punishment, possibly death. Kirkland carried these experiences forward into his post-war life without apparent complaint or visible damage. This, too, was a form of survival, the continuation of function after experiences that broke other men. He had proven that he could think when thinking seemed impossible. He proved it again by building a life that did not depend on what he had done in the war. The lesson his story offers is not about heroism in the conventional sense. Heroism implies nobility, sacrifice, the willing acceptance of risk for others. What Kirkland demonstrated was something different and perhaps more useful: the capacity for continued function when every rational calculation argues for surrender. War rewards many qualities: courage, strength, endurance, luck. But among all these, perhaps the most valuable is the simple refusal to stop thinking. The man who continues to calculate when calculation seems pointless. The mind that finds gaps in certainty while others see only walls. Edward R. Kirkland flew his last combat mission over Germany in 1944. He spent time as a prisoner of the Reich. He escaped twice from systems designed to make escape impossible. He returned to Allied lines, and then to America, and then to the quiet life that absorbed millions of veterans like water absorbing rain. The sky that had nearly killed him became a memory. The wire that had held him ceased to exist. The guards who had watched him scattered into defeat. What remained was the proof that assumptions could be wrong, that systems could fail, that somewhere in the gap between probability and certainty there was always room for a man who refused to stop looking.